It may have something like 25 million people. There's sort of some dispute about numbers because the way Chinese statistics deals with immigration. But the point here is that this transformation that you see from the top panel, somewhat Stalinistic city, in about the late 80s to what it is today, took 25 years. 25 years. So that's not even a generation, right? So cities and urban environments produce massive change, can produce massive change very quickly in one generation, basically. That's the rule of thumb. And we cannot produce, there's no way in which any societies produce this sort of massive transformation in any other way. It happens through urbanization. So you shouldn't just see urbanization, as these pictures show, as a change in the built environment. It is that too, but it is really a change in many other things, as I started to say. It's the way people live, what they know, what they consume, you know, many other things. So the point about this is that in China and everywhere else, certainly in the United States, where we are, these transformations have been spectacular. In China and East Asia, this took maybe about 500 million people out of poverty, which has been some of the great successes of the last few decades of policy and development. But it's unsustainable. As we know, China, for example, is now the biggest carbon emitter in the world. So we need to understand the process by which this happens, but at the same time, we have to have an eye for making it different, for making it sustainable in the sense of climate impacts, but also since you're in Guyana and you have much of your territory is forest and it's wonderful rainforest and so on, how are these landscapes and their biodiversity protected? So when you look at cities, something weird happens immediately, which is that, I mean, you kind of know this, but what's new is that we can put all kinds of numbers to this, and I'll show you some. So this is a traditional slide from a few years ago. Jose and I went to Quito, and this is the time for one of the UN meetings. I'm sure maybe we'll meet each other at maybe in a couple of years at the next one, the World Urban Forum. But at this time in 2015, this is when the new Sustainable Development Goals and the new urban agenda, the new sort of cycle of UN documents were assembled and voted. And there was a focus at this time on urbanization. It was pretty clear that the world was already becoming more than 50% urban. That happened around 2007, 2008. So it's fresh in people's mind. But even by the roughest estimates, what you find is that even though the world by population is about 50% urban, there's some definitions that go with this that we could discuss. And there's an estimate that means about an occupation of about 2% or less, by some estimates, more like 1.5% of land area. You could ask what that is for Guyana. Your cities are not very dense, but it's probably less than that. Nevertheless, 70% of the GDP, 60% of global energy consumption, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of global waste. And we could go on about educated people, health, and so on. So much more than 50% is the point, is concentrated or generated by cities. So we'll focus a little bit on GDP for a second. So this means that wealth and sort of the many things that come with it, or at least consumption, is amplified, not just proportionally to population, but somehow something else is going on, that cities amplify this population to be more productive. And this became something that was kind of known a little bit to economists and geographers, but a lot of the work that we've done with Jose and many others, now it's a big field in the last almost 20 years now, has been about quantifying these effects and understanding them from a fundamental perspective. And the answer is that basically cities, by bringing people together over space, create network opportunities. We have to connect to each other in many different ways. Some of them are economic, generating GDP and other things. But there are all kinds of other things happening as well. Relationships around politics, relationships around urban services, relationships about healthcare, everything. And so that starts producing these very systemic effects. And these systemic effects, many of them are challenges, like carbon emissions, or I'll show you later crime, but many others are also the things that we want, so like higher economic productivity, better health, better education, and so on. So these are kind of the numbers that we knew coming into this work. So sometimes I use these slides because they make it relatively simple. So when you look at two cities of different sizes within a country, usually, so that we have the same sort of population and technological baseline and policy baseline, when you compare a city that's double the size of another, its economic productivity goes up by about 15%, 10 to 20%. Is typical. And this happens in almost every urban system that we've been able to look at. It happens in past urban systems with very different economic and political systems. It's a property of almost anything that's socioeconomic. So I have a list there in small fonts on top that shows, for example, productivity, invention, energy use. Energy use is a little tricky because they're different forms. Built spaces, the heights of buildings, all kinds of things. It's kind of crazy when you think about it at the first time. Why is this all happening together? But also some things that are like crime. This is from also an early paper by an urban economist at Glaser at Harvard. But this became sort of lower, that the same numbers pop up, that when you compare cities of different sizes, you also tend to have things that mediated about social networks, such as crime, to some extent, also increased by a similar amount. So what you get with larger cities and urbanization more generally is that you get essentially, I'll come back to this again and again, is an acceleration and intensification of socioeconomic life. And this, if it's well managed, will lead to productivity, invention, better social relations, better politics, and so on, even though there's always a struggle. But if it's poorly managed, it leads to a lot of segregation, crime, violence, congestion, and so on. And these things are always there. So they need to be sort of managed as you go. So this is just a heads up for what's to come. So you can study this very, in many places. So I'm going to flash a bunch of these slides. We studied from the beginning. We used this method called scaling, which basically does something very simple, just plots the average GDP in log coordinates with the average log population. And this gives you this percentage number, the elasticity that says that it increases more than proportionally. So these numbers 1 plus 1.6, so 1 plus 0.15 is what you see. So these are cities in Europe. You see this for patents as a proxy for innovation. Jose has done a lot of work on that. He's really an expert on that. You should ask them. But also there's urban expansion of area, but here there's a saving. This number is a little bit smaller, so people use less space per capita as you go up. This is good because they maybe will have to use less forest or other land that may be other uses and so on. So there's a bunch of structural transformations. This is for China. China is a very noisy system. As you get following the news, probably we're seeing what happens to its cities, but has the same average properties, but interesting regional differences. This is for the United States, GDP, and what I'm showing on the left is road surface. But this is true about built surface for buildings and other things. So again, there's sort of a shrinking of space per capita, and there's an intensification of socioeconomic output. So we've come to call this effect sort of a reactor. It's a bit like this, an analogy. This is just an analogy, right? It's not a perfect metaphor. It's a bit like a star. You bring people together, they interact more, and they produce more, not so much light, but all the things that people produce together socially and economically and so on. And those things are both good and bad, but they're mostly good actually on balance. And the process becomes self-fulfilling, and an urban society is able of generating new knowledge and economic productivity in a way that a society where people live separately cannot. Okay, so now I want to kind of focus this process on just a few case studies that I'm going to use for Guyana later. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare the talk, so I had a few slides from my own country of birth, Portugal. Thomas and I were talking a little bit about it. Portuguese people, if you give them a boat, they jump on a boat and they may end up in Guyana, certainly in Brazil, and many other places. So, I have sort of, my name is associated with probably some piracy, or at least people who are sailors and so on. So they show up in places that have ports. But here's what, so there's Portugal. I'm going to use Portugal a little bit as sort of a case study, but then I'm going to start comparing to other countries that, including Guyana, that go through these trajectories. So I'm showing you here is a very classical, Jose and I discussed this many times, relationship. It's a very noisy relationship, as you can start to see, excuse me, between GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing parity on the y-axis, and again, we take the log, and percent of a nation, these are all nations, that is urban, okay? And so what you see here is that different nations are the different spaghetti lines, so it's kind of noisy, but there's a general tendency for countries that are more urban, more of the population is urban, to have higher GDP. And so when you put some numbers to this, I try to indicate them there, you go from most countries, so this is data that's historical, some of it goes back as far back as anyone has studied each one of these countries, but it's all modern data. Since 1800s or 1700s in some cases, but most of the data is in the last 6 decades. So you go from essentially subsistence at about less than $1 per capita per day, which is sort of at almost zero, a very low urbanization, to about $50,000 per year per capita, which is basically the standard of a developed country. As you can see here, There are a few countries, all countries have their history, but some behave quite different. So Liberia, indicated there, is a country that had, excuse me, a civil war. So a lot of people came to cities as refugees, and this did not result in happy urbanization. In fact, it decreased, at least for a while, GDP per capita and many other social and health indicators, though it's recovering now a little bit. But most countries that go through this transition gradually actually do well. And I'm showing you more examples. So Portugal, you see there, is going along that line, but it's above the line. It's actually overperforming it. But as of now, it's only about 2/3, 67% urbanized. So I want to show you some trajectories of different countries, because then we got to look at Guyana. And in Guyana, as you know, not much has happened yet. So it's kind of an anticipated transformation in many ways. So people certainly that look at economic history like to look at the United States. So there it is on the top left panel. This is data that goes back to the first census, 1790. And what you see there, the other thing I want to say is that the line here expresses the fact that with 1% increase in urban population, you get about 4 to 5% increase in real GDP per capita. So think about that. That's an immense return. It's kind of amazing, right? So imagine, so as I slide the line, you know, if I go along the line, I get this amazing return, you know, almost like, you know, 400%. So that's amazing. So you can do this for individual countries. And here's sort of a panel of countries. So USA, as I started to say, this took a long time for the United States to urbanize. It was about the 50% urban sort of midpoint was in about 1920. Then you see a few other countries, mostly in Europe and Asia. So France, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and China. South Korea and China are very interesting because they're recent urbanizers. They did it very quickly, and they're doing it quite successfully. More on that in a moment. But you see, for example, the UK, which is a low, it was the earliest country to urbanize, you know, the whole history of industrial revolution and so on. But did it, when you compare it to modern standards, which maybe is unfair, but when you do that, its early urbanization was bad, right? This is what got us Marx and Engels and so on, talking about the condition of the working class in England and Wales, was really that people, you know, life expectancy in a place like Manchester in the late 19th century, something like 27 years of age, right? So it's just bad urbanization. So this actually marked the field to think that urbanization is typically bad. It creates pollution, poor health, and so on. With modern knowledge and with modern patterns, that's not what we see. It tends to be positive, though problems come along with it. But this is kind of just to show you a little bit about that. So the meaning of this log of GDP is really an integrated growth rate, a growth rate per unit time, but integrated over a number of years. So the number of years of these trajectories. So just to show you what this means. So what we're really looking is at a growth rate. And what we need to do is to replace time by urbanization. So here, what I'm showing you are trajectories of urbanization. So here it really is the urbanization rate, so the percent of people on the y-axis that live in cities in each one of these countries versus time. So it's now years on the x-axis. And so what you see here, and this S -1, it's funny notation, is basically the time scale, the speed at which each country urbanized. So you see the US, the UK, France, and even Spain is very slow. These took basically several generations to urbanize. They're quite slow by modern standards. In comparison, look at South Korea on the bottom right, and it was basically, you know, maybe 4 times or 5 times faster than so urbanized essentially in 1 generation. As we know, it's associated with often described as an economic miracle. But it's all but what's interesting is not like an economic miracle in abstract. It's an urbanization miracle, actually. And as I'll show you, actually, its urbanization was a little bit underproductive. It just happened very quickly, and it was productive enough that it created really a very bright pattern of development that economists often talk about. So this is just to show you that urbanization works at different speeds. More modern countries that urbanize later, they're urbanizing now, tend to urbanize quite quickly. And many countries now urbanize in 1 generation. This is what we're seeing now. So again, heads up for Guyana. Okay, so there are 2 effects at play here. I just want to make this point. One effect, the slow effect, is that each place, if you focus on Georgetown or one of your cities, you know, how is life changing Georgetown over time, right? And usually that's quite slow. that's associated with so-called intensive or endogenous growth. And this requires technological transformations, educational transformations, institutional transformations, and it happens at 1 to 2% a year, typically. This is typical for the United States, about 2% a year. And so what you have is that this is kind of painful, necessary, steady, but difficult, and it's quite slow. On the other hand, if you have an environment that already sort of works, or works better than smaller environments because of some of these network effects and the scaling laws, then you can just move people there, and they adjust to it. They learn these environments, and by moving people quickly, you can produce the effect very quickly without having to transform it, because you're moving people from a low productivity environment to a higher productivity environment, hoping that it doesn't degrade the high productivity environment. So, but when this happens, you get these very fast transformations, and that's what happens in most of these countries. So this happens to give you a speed boost. This is kind of low mathy, I apologize, but the plot on the left is showing you that if you look at the actual growth rate in time of an economy as it goes through urbanization, so the interesting lines are the green and the red, which are basically the actual growth rate, and the green is a fit from a model that has these features. What you have is that it's about maybe 2% or something like this when you fully urbanize. So this is kind of sometimes called countries at frontier, something more like the United States and other urban European countries. But in the middle, when you're about 5% urbanized or something, 50%, then you can have a bit of a speed boost. So at that point, you can actually go very quickly if your urbanization is efficient. This is a lot of what happened in Korea. It happened recently in China. China now is about 65% urbanized, so they're slowing down. Okay, so back to this case study, because this is something we could do. But this is just to show you a little bit what's going on. Can cities absorb people, make them productive, provide them with good living conditions and so on, such that this process that's nucleated in a small population can actually spread quickly? So what I'm comparing here again is Portugal to the United States. Took much longer. If you look at those labels in time, Portugal, of course, had a long time in which people got in boats and got away. You know, there's sort of a parallel there to you and your large diaspora to some extent. But since the 70s and so on, it's a country that started urbanizing more and arrested some of its out migration, and though that's still a work in progress. But you see here that the trajectory actually has been very positive, and when you compare these things face to face, much better actually than the United States at the same level of urbanization. This is typical also of countries that are urbanizing now. So this is kind of interesting. So hold on to that. So from this perspective, the question is, okay, can I push that 66% or 60 points in 2020 to become 85% and be much better than the United States? And then Portugal will be one of the richest countries in the world and have wonderful cities and have great development indices and so on. So the development transformation is an urbanization and structural transformation, right? So this asks the question, what do we need to do in our cities? What do we need to do to understand migration, what people are choosing to live and so on? That's that this could happen, it could happen quickly. Okay, so here's just another example with a little bit more juice for you. So I tried to put the place where Guyana has been over the last 60 years or so. We'll get back to this. They're in green, but I'm comparing here to two other faster urbanizers. So there's Korea and Finland. These are kind of interesting for Portugal. But Korea, as you can see, did actually not get so much income of its urbanization until more recently. Finland has a much more balanced trajectory. But Portugal is actually better than them, given the same level of urbanization. So this is interesting. And here's a comparison that maybe is more relevant to you. This is two oil-rich nations. So it's just the same game, but trying to do this for two other nations, Saudi Arabia and Norway. And Norway, you know, was plodding along more or less, but then it discovered oil in the 60s, and then that started to be explored in earnest in the early 70s and thereabouts. I'm sure you've studied what they've done with it. And I'm sure you've studied what the Saudis and others have done with it. Somewhat different. They have sovereign funds, but the policy around it is very different. There's a lot of social policy in Norway that's supported and made stable by the way their funds are managed. And so you see here that Norway did really well once it had money. It was urbanized further, but also did very well in terms of income per capita. This is also true in terms of any other indicator. Norway is the highest human development index country in the world. I'll get back to that in a moment. But Saudi Arabia, you know, has money, but hasn't done so well. Very unstable, for one thing, and so on. And so, you know, this is just like, you know, if you read the news, you know, the news about Saudi Arabia, of course, is a country that has not delivered, great living standards for all its population. Particularly, there's a gender issue and many others. It's remained somewhat unstable and tied to oil revenues as they go up and down. Norway, on the other hand, completely different story, right? You don't even know they're an oil country if you didn't know it. But, it's an example of policy. So this is just an example of the last few years. I've just handpicked a few examples. But here's a paper on the right saying how it weathered the COVID pandemic. And as you see, the third point, and the point that you see whenever you're discussing how well Norway does, is that the oil and gas industry and the sovereign wealth fund insulate Norway from the full economic consequences of the pandemic and its pandemic response. So basically, Norway very consciously uses its oil wealth and gas wealth to even out social policy, to create high standards, but also to be able to weather crisis, so that it's able to counter-invest in times of economic contraction or high prices. So this is kind of different. But it's very important that you can have very different outcomes with the same, at least at some level, scenario. So urbanization basically gets you this idea of the escalator. If you are able to get people to places where they're more productive, more connected, and more access to services and healthcare and so on, you can speed up the process of development. And in the formation of those networks is the process of development, is what I'm saying. Okay, so back to this plot. So you can go back and see, so in Portugal is a similar thing, that you go to larger cities, higher GDP per capita and so on. Again, very few points, a bit like Guyana, for which I don't even have this data. I'll show you some other data. But the one aspect of that you see in Portugal, you see this in many other countries, it's also true, by the way, of the UK or France, is that the urban system is quite uneven. So this is a famous regularity in somewhat mystical called Zipf's law. It's about the relative size distribution of cities. And he makes a certain prediction that the second city in an urban system should be about half the size of the largest city, and the third largest city is about a third, and so on. This emerges when there's balanced migration between settlements, so that if you imagine people going from Georgetown to a different city, there are as many people coming in the opposite direction. So it doesn't mean that people are canceling each other out. They do this throughout their life course and so on, but that there's a sense in which to have opportunities and have a good life, you don't have to go to a specific place, but you can move around the urban system, and this remains somewhat balanced. So a signature of places that are in certain intermediate stages of urbanization is that the large cities take the lead. As you see here, Lisbon and Porto are the two largest cities, if you know a little bit about Portugal, but all the others are too small, right? And this means that basically that people don't want to live in those smallest places because things are not good enough there. So, for example, education. And so I'll come back to this because this is a feature, as you probably know, of Guyana, as far as I can tell in data. Okay. The other thing I want to say is that urbanization creates many other outcomes. So I'm going to go slightly faster through this, but I already mentioned human development. So when you look at human development, it's a compound of real incomes, of health measured through life expectancy, which is sort of an integral of all the health conditions that people experience through their life course, and education. And this has a famous history in terms of Nobel Prize in economics for the capabilities approach and so on. But what I'm showing you here is that no matter where you measure it, you tend to see that larger cities, here the orange line, tend to have higher levels of human development index than the corresponding nations. So what this means necessarily is that larger cities have higher human development index values than smaller cities, okay? And during moments of transition, you saw some exceptions like Liberia, but the expectation in general, you see here Monrovia, capital Liberia, is there too, below the line. But in most cases, what happens is that it's the largest cities that nucleate this process. So people move there first, and then the indices of development spread throughout the country. This is not necessarily what should happen, but it's often observed as a pattern. Okay, so I'm just going to show you some data that you can perform this at different scales. So this is for the city where I live in Chicago. And when you look at this, you see there are very different standards of living in terms of human development in different neighborhoods of the city. So that's what all these little shapes in different colors are. So some are better than Norway, which, by the way, is the highest HDI country in the world, not Saudi Arabia. And but other neighborhoods that have living conditions that are worse than places where people migrate from, and so on. So, you know, it's very unequal, and this is a real issue and challenge when we think about development, is that there's inequality on many different scales across the country, but also locally within cities. So you can go and look at this. There are many examples in the United States, again, of also regionally oil and gas rich places, like some of the cities in the Gulf of Mexico that have high income. So they rank high on that, but they have low education and healthcare outcomes. So they rank relatively low, not very low in absolute terms worldwide, but in terms of the United States, there's sort of missed opportunities of a similar kind. Okay, you also see the effect that larger cities do better and so on. And the places that, you know, if there's sort of an archetypal kind of model of what are the places that are successful, what they look like for this metric, which is a very celebrated metric, they're basically college towns. They're places where people have a good life. They're not necessarily very rich. They have a good living standard economically. They have high education, and they have usually good health. These things compound. And in fact, you can see that with high human development, this is true at national level. I'm showing you here for neighborhoods in the United States. It's a bit complicated. Ask me more if you want. But all these problems of no plumbing, smoking, no health insurance, teeth loss, obesity, almost poor mental health, all these things go away as people have more access to education, to a decent income, and to better healthcare. So basically, you resolve all these typical challenges of development, including crime, by essentially creating conditions of high human development. So I call this the Anna Karenina principle. Sorry to push this point, but basically all places that are developed look more or less the same. People don't have massive problems of subsistence and existence, but places that have low human development have all kinds of problems that sort of appear different. In some cases, they have a problem with COVID. Some other places, they have a lot of crime. Some other places have a lot of obesity. And sometimes they have all of these things, but they're kind of more noisy. Just parts of life go wrong in different ways in different places. Okay, so this is to say that when you look at cities, you also have to look across scales. There are patterns that express citywide, like economic productivity. Then there are places that if you're interested in equity and inequality, that you need to come down to the neighborhood level and individual level in order to understand, and that the life course of individuals as they experience these various environments matters a lot for the outcomes, not only for themselves, but also for the system as a whole. So there's a lot to unpack there. You'd really have to have a few more talks to get there. But I hope that sort of the ability of work across scales becomes very important. Okay, now this is kind of just the first theme. So I want to go a little faster. The second and third are faster. So I want to go a little bit through sustainable urbanization, how it's being conceptualized and how is it being operationalized. So at the moment, just to say it, there's no sustainable urbanization. All cities are not sustainable. They were based on the basis. They were built on the basis of resource consumption that is not sustainable or circular. But at the same time, cities express a lot of savings in terms of lower energy and resource consumption per capita, given their productivity. So this is kind of a tricky thing to say, but the idea is that many people are writing about, if you're going to have so many people in the future, this may not be an issue for Guyana, but we have to have them in a place where they don't destroy a lot of land uses and so on. So this is from Kim Stanley Robinson, one of my favorite science fiction writers. You should read sort of The Ministry of the Future, which is about the transition of the next few years. But this is an op-ed about the necessity of urbanization for sustainability, because there you can create high living standards without creating a huge footprint, both immediate and in terms of then making it sustainable. So the framework, as you know, because you work at UN, has to do with Sustainable Development Goals, and within these, there's sort of a goal that's about cities, and that includes essentially these targets. Housing, transportation, sustainable planning, we'll talk a little bit about this, but other things too. So the point about this kind of framework, Sustainable Development Goals, but increasingly policy frameworks like this, is that they have a few key ingredients. First, they have a long time scale. There's sort of a plan, usually at 15 years for the UN, but a lot of cities are creating also for climate targets, 20-year, 30-year goals. So the other element, so this gives you a long-term, a generational term to achieve something exceptional. And it's very important that you do that. You don't achieve such things in a year or in 4 years for a politician. You need those 20 years. The second thing is that they're quantitative. All these things become quantitative targets. There's some discussion about how best to quantify them and so on, but the point is that you measure them every year to see if you're getting there, or more frequently if you can. And this kind of shows you that some things are not working, or shows you when they're not working, but also shows you that somebody else may actually have a good solution that you should copy and so on. So this is a different policy framework that allows people to collaborate following the same objectives, allows you to find solutions that context appropriate, but also allows you to check if you're doing it right or not. So this kind of loop is kind of like science, you know? You're trying to make a hypothesis about what's going to work. You're going to measure it against evidence. And you're going to see if it's right, or most likely if it's wrong or insufficient. So these are now called voluntary local reviews. They try to implement the UN Sustainable Goals at the level of cities and sometimes regions. So there's a whole process here. Ask me about it. You probably already know about it. But one of the things that would be interesting to conceive of, maybe already doing it, is to do this at a regional and city scale in Guyana. So here's an example for New York City. They have a very ambitious plan, as it goes with New York often. It's called One NYC 2050. And so, has many, again, same somewhat thing that, you have general objectives, and then you have sort of sets of targets, and then these have sets of indicators. So for example, here's, it's hard to read. I don't expect you to read in detail what's at the bottom, but the idea is that in order to create sustainable cities and communities, then there are a bunch of objectives that New York sees as its ways of implementing it, from bringing the park agency to the people who do environmental quality, to the people who do trash collection. They all need to work together on a 20-year time scale to get there, and they have to measure a lot of things. So this plot at the bottom is showing you that GDP per capita is going up, the top line, whereas energy consumption is going down. So this is good. It's not enough, but it's going the right direction. And you know how well you're doing it. This is Chicago. I'm not going to dwell on this in the interest of time, but similar objectives. And now a lot of data that allows us to also see what some of these issues are. So with data from satellites, you can measure every tree, you see how well it's doing, you can see heat, you can see water. So you're able to have these very detailed maps, and then, and the idea is to work with populations on the ground to see how they experience these issues and try to create loops of policy that create equity, but also solve problems systemically. So for example, I wanted to show you this example for Barcelona. So this is an example in the same spirit of trying to fight homelessness and provide decent housing for people. So on the left, what you see is actually the problem is getting worse, right? Not better. So you see that you want to follow these lines that would take you, take these dots, more or less maroon, up to 100%, and they actually are going down. This is people receiving assistance. And then you'd like to reduce homelessness. So you want to follow this black line to bring it down. And what you see is that it's actually increasing. So this shows you that whatever they're doing in Barcelona, at least in these years, which was a little while ago now, is not working. So this is kind of the kind of thing that, politicians and people in urban agencies and government agencies need to know in order to adjust course. It's a different way of doing policy, of just passing funding and hoping for the best. Is actually to monitor what you hope for and try to develop the innovation systems that will take you there, okay? So I want to just spend the last 10 minutes or so talking a little bit about Guyana more specifically. Now, again, I'll re-express the caveat. I've never been to Guyana. I don't know much about it. All that I'm going to do is to show you some my interpretation of some of the data that I could find for Guyana, and also express some of the caveats of what I could not find. And then it would be wonderful if Guyana statistics or people at universities such as yourselves would start producing it or create a way in which it was produced. So so here's the first thing that you see, so we've been talking about urbanization as a process of development. You go to Guyana, you look at the plot, see this World Bank data. World Bank does this for every nation that they were using. And here it is. So you guys can disabuse me if this is not right, but it's going down, okay? And it says that Guyana is about, in 2020 anyway, about 27% urbanized. Okay, so this is kind of very unusual. I showed you all these countries going up and you guys are going down. So it's an interesting question, at least for me, it was surprising. So why? How could this possibly be happening if in every other nation it seems to be happening, sort of in the opposite direction? And this pattern is also unusual even for the region. So here's some of your neighbors, Suriname, Venezuela, and they're much more urbanized than you are. So Suriname, probably a more relevant comparison, about the same as Portugal, 67% or so. And Venezuela, of course, has been traditionally higher, but obviously the last few years have been difficult. But a huge difference in any case, okay? And here's some other things that caught my eye. So these are homicide rates, as you know, at least the news say that. The news and the data say that Guyana has a very high homicide rate and a lot of crime. These seem to be higher in Georgetown and some of the largest cities. It's, I think these numbers are something like 3 times or 4 times the US numbers, and the US is not a peaceful place. Maybe 10 to 20 times numbers for Europe. So these are very high numbers. And this is kind of a problem. You cannot do cities and grow cities with very high growth crime rates. They become impossible, right? They become just, the opportunities for violence just multiply, as I mentioned before. So this is kind of a problem that needs to be resolved. And just a few things now that you probably know about. So this is individuals' access to the internet. And it's somewhat, I don't know if this has a relationship or not. It's low, about less than 40%. But as you can see, maybe, there are a few recent years here missing here, but nevertheless, something like that until recently. But what you also see, these numbers are quite comparable to the urbanization numbers. I wonder if they're, people in cities probably have more access to the internet. That is typically true in other places, but you guys can tell me about that. So this is low as a measure for sort of a new service coming up. Your CO2 emissions are going up. They're still quite low. So I see this more as an opportunity to think about zeroing this out, even as you produce oil for export and so on. But with green energy, and I believe from the documents you shared with me that this is something Guyana's thinking about doing. This is important in a different way. But then here's the real problem, right? And I think you know about this, but it surprised me. But Thomas mentioned this a little bit in the introduction, is that when you look at migration patterns, where you can look at population growth, but when you look really at what's happening to migration, is that a lot of the population of Guyana has been migrating out of the country. And so I think these are 5-year increments. This is again World Bank data, but it means that over 5 years, something like 30,000 people, this is a net, have left Guyana for other countries. And given the size of your population, this is sizable. It's about 1% a year or a bit more. And this ebbed and flowed. It was worse, as you can see here, in the 80s and 90s. I'm sure you know about this, but this surprised me. And it's substantial. It's one of the countries with greatest rate in percent of out migration in the world, short of a conflict or something like that. And when you unpack this is a UNICEF report. Again, all this data is just stuff I grabbed, and I hope you have better data than this. But here it is. So who migrates? This is also an urban universal or demographic universal. Young people migrate, always. And so the people that are leaving the country are all basically young and in working age. So you see probably the 2013 table here to the right is the most expressive. In previous years, the numbers are small because you're not a large country, but nevertheless, this adds up. And there are not many people sort of in a specific age bracket that can be productive, or that are basically building their professional life to be productive. And if you measure these by education, higher education, and so on, the numbers would be very small, right? Hundreds of people, probably less. So what this shows is that basically the outflow is that you're losing the most productive people in the country at a crucial age. And this is kind of a bad news. So usually these people are coming to cities. This is what I want to say. So if you look at any other country, these are the people that are moving to the large cities. They're kind of trying the bright lights of the city. They're having fun for a little while, and then they're assembling their professional life. They have to learn and adapt and be entrepreneurial as they do so. And a lot of these people are just not doing it within the country. So this is just from the same report, the same thing. This is sort of the total population and then the migrant stock. So as you can see there, it's just another way of showing what the tables before were showing, which is mostly, it's people in the most productive time of their lives. They're leaving, and they're leaving mostly, I think these are the total numbers at the bottom, to the United States, Canada, and Britain, but really the United States to a large extent. And you're receiving some population coming in, as Thomas referred to, but the numbers, at least by these tables that I could find, which are a little bit old now, are completely different, right? An order of magnitude different. So the outflows are much, much, much larger. And that's kind of your main problem, is that a lot of these people that are kind of building their lives and looking towards what the future should be are not staying in Guyana, they're going somewhere else. And therefore you don't see urbanization. These people would have stayed in a large city in classical scenarios, but they're not doing that in Guyana. And what you see is that, in fact, it's out of the largest cities that you see a lot of the outflows. They're comparable, but they're not great. So life expectancy is still below 70 years, which is relatively low by modern standards. You know, GDP per capita is by these numbers about 3,400, which is low. It's about an order of magnitude below developed countries and so on. So this is the point that I put on those plots. Okay, so this is sort of, we're getting to the end, about more or less on the hour, and this is sort of what I could find. The map on the left is from Wikipedia, and it's not exactly the cities on the right. The cities on the right, again, you know your reality. I've just got this from census tables. They have the tables in PDF, bless them. And so I had to kind of hand code them, but it's just a few cities, so that's okay. But all the data I found from the census 2012, and now you have a census in 2022, so that was going to be interesting to compare, has been really about demographics, and very little that would be economic. There's a little bit on sectors, economic sectors and buildings, but the census seemed relatively basic in terms of understanding some of the development indicators going towards sustainable development goals and so on. So there's a lot of work that could be done there. Maybe it's being done in order to align what you know about Guyana statistically and how to align those numbers with targets that I just couldn't find evidence for at the moment. But what you see here is basically the size of the largest settlements, the ones I could find. And again, it's the same story that I showed you for Portugal, that compared to Georgetown, which is the largest city here on 00, all the other sites are smaller. Linden, I believe, it's kind of a backside sort of mining town. It's the second largest, so but quite specialized, and therefore, you know, sort of extractive industry, very exposed to its ebbs and flows in terms of pricing and so on, and in terms of that sector being viable into the far future, and then all the other sites being quite small, you know, just a few tens or even just a few thousand people. So clearly, you know, you don't quite have an urban system, and you have very small places that presumably still have a lot of development ahead of them. And so the idea is that the migration flows, I couldn't get this directly, is that partly people that are growing up in Guyana funneling through the largest cities, but then they go away into other nations and so on. And so in some sense, this pattern is very atypical. It's contrary to everything I told you in the first part of the talk. And so my reflection, and maybe things we can discuss a little bit, is how might you reverse it? And how might you use urbanization as a process of sustainable development along the lines of what I described? So, you know, I was just trying to summarize a little bit what that would look like. So these would be sort of, if you will, you know, from Chicago, never been to Guyana, but sort of what I would like to see, to believe, knowing what I know from other countries, what you need to do in Guyana. The first thing is really reverse foreign out migration. So it doesn't mean that some people don't continue to leave, but you need some people to come, and you cannot be losing sort of your young people to other places. So that's not only just a fact, it's also a litmus test. If you saw that you could reverse these migration flows, that people would want to stay in Guyana and, you know, invest their lives into mostly your cities in the nation, then you know that it's working, that whatever you're doing is good. So that's the first step. The second step is that the reason for that is in part that you have to compare the standard of living and opportunities in Georgetown and the other cities to the places where people are going to. And so you have to promote high and even, not very unequal, living standards across your cities. So it means low crime, better schools, healthcare, advanced education, green industry, things that are actually sort of more cutting edge and are attractive. So part of what this problem is to have a sense of what people are looking for when they migrate out of the country. And there may be that you don't have to have, you know, super advanced sectors to begin with, but you should use that process to get there. and this has to happen in a way that's balanced across the territory. So countries that have done this, they're also small. Places like Switzerland or Norway or the Netherlands, they have a very balanced urban system where the large city does not dominate, and where the standards of living in smaller cities are very good, maybe better. And so these create sort of a distribution and many places for people to go that creates wealth without huge cities. Then what I recommend for you in the Institute, it seems to me, is that you could develop or help develop sustainability plans with quantitative targets in the spirit of what I flashed before that many cities are doing in each settlement and for the nation. Maybe you're already doing this, but this should really be done at the settlement level, at the city level. And it's not so hard given the sizes of settlements, you know everything about the built environment. I think you could know a lot about demographics and so on, and just set them on a trajectory that's measurable, falsifiable, that takes 20 or 30 years, but that produces in one generation the kind of development that one could hope for. And you know, for doing that, you need to have create the technical capacity for people in government and at universities to be able to do that. So you can tell me if you have it or if you're creating it or not. And finally, you know, use the oil money not only for investment in all these things, but also what Norway did very well is that it creates stability. You can really plan 30 years out, knowing that if COVID hits or if the prices of oil change, you're going to be okay. You can keep on trucking, you can keep on going, and you have the time to get to where you need to go. So I know that may seem challenging given your starting point, but that really is a big lesson. It's not just about quantities of money. It's also about creating an environment where you can plan for the long term and be able to execute over 20 or 30 years. So my prediction is that if you can do that in 20 or 30 years, you could do, you know, what other countries have done. It's not like it's not been done before. It has been done before. That you could be among the most developed urbanized countries in the world, and you'd become an attractive place, as Thomas started to say, for people also from other regions to come and live and work. But the transformation has these signals. You can follow it, you can measure it, you know what it looks like, and it's been done before, and now you have the resources to execute. So with that, these are just where you can find me. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I'm very hopeful for your country. But there's a lot that can be done, that should be done in your own terms, that lies ahead. So thank you.